The vote passed before I finished my coffee. I was sitting in Gallery 7 of Council Station Vale 7, watching the session feed on the small screen built into my armrest, half listening to the procedural motions that typically dragged on for 2 hours before anything worth noting happened. My coffee was still hot. The station's climate system hummed at its usual pitch. Nothing about that morning had felt different from any other morning in the 11 years I had served as Earth's representative to the Galactic Council. Then High Arbiter Solneth called the emergency motion to the floor, and everything changed in about 40 seconds. My name is Yara Osai. I am 43 years old, born in Accra, raised partly in London, and I have spent the better part of 2 decades learning how to sit in rooms full of beings who do not think of humans as particularly important. It is a skill. You learn to breathe slowly. You learn to keep your face calm even when a 6-limbed creature with 3 rows of teeth is explaining, in perfectly polite diplomatic language, that your species does not yet understand the weight of galactic responsibility. You smile. You take notes. You wait. I had been waiting a long time. The Veth Dominion's lead representative, a tall being named Curator Draveneth, stood at the central podium with the particular stillness that his species used when they wanted everyone in the room to feel small. The Veth were old. Their civilization had been navigating the stars for 600 years before humans had discovered fire. They dressed in layered gray robes and moved like they were already tired of your presence before you had opened your mouth. Draveneth laid out the charges in a flat, measured tone that reminded me of a judge reading a verdict he considered obvious. The Veth Intelligence Division had intercepted data transmissions from Earth's research facilities. The transmissions contained signatures consistent with adaptive reconfiguration systems. Under Section 9 of the Verath Accords, which Earth had signed upon joining the Council, adaptive reconfiguration systems of a certain yield classification were prohibited outside of approved research programs submitted to the Council for review. Earth had submitted no such review. Therefore, Earth was in violation. He paused, let that sit. Then he moved the emergency motion. Formal censure was insufficient, he argued, given the scope of the violation and Earth's short history as a Council member. The Veth Dominion called for a declaration of military conflict to be enforced by Council-sanctioned forces until Earth's programs were dismantled and its research institutions opened to full inspection. There were 61 species represented in that chamber. I watched their reaction the way you watch weather form, reading the currents before the rain starts. Some were alarmed. A few were calculating. Most were simply deferring to the Veth, the way the smaller, newer members always deferred to the Veth, because the Veth had 16 warships for every one that the next largest fleet could muster, and in galactic politics, that kind of math has a way of shaping opinion. The debate lasted 6 minutes. That was not a long debate by Council standards. I had once watched a committee spend 4 hours arguing over the font size of a trade agreement header. 6 minutes. The vote came, 47 in favor, 11 opposed, 3 abstaining. The Galactic Council, by majority motion, had just declared war on Earth. I looked at my coffee, still warm. Then I started laughing. It was not a polite laugh. It was not the kind of carefully controlled smile that diplomats deploy when they want to seem approachable without revealing anything. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere deep, from a place that has been holding something in for a very long time and suddenly has permission to let it go. The chamber went silent. 61 species, representing roughly 300 star systems and several thousand years of collective diplomatic history, stared at me. I was the only human in the room. I was, at that moment, technically the representative of a planet that had just been declared an enemy of the Galactic Council, and I was laughing. Curator Draveneth's crest, the wide ridge of pale cartilage along the top of his skull that served as a kind of emotional display for his species, shifted from its usual neutral gray to a mottled, uncertain violet. That was the Veth equivalent of someone blinking several times in rapid confusion. High Arbiter Solneth, whose species had 4 eyes and used all of them efficiently, turned two of them toward me with an expression I could only describe as deeply unsettled. "Representative Osai," Solnath said, using the formal address with extra precision, the way people do when they want to remind you that you are supposed to be behaving. "This chamber has just rendered a binding motion." "I know," I said. I put my coffee down. I straightened my jacket. I got my face under control mostly, though I could still feel the edges of the laugh trying to come back. "I apologize for the disruption, High Arbiter. I would like to invoke my right to address the chamber before any enforcement measures are actioned." There was a murmur. A few species exchanged what I assumed were significant looks, though reading alien facial expressions across 61 different anatomies is an art form I had only partially mastered. Draveneth said, quietly but clearly, "The representative of the offending party does not traditionally address the chamber following a conflict declaration." "Traditionally," I agreed, "but the procedural statutes of the Galactic Council, Article 14, Clause 3, grant any member representative the right to an address before enforcement action is taken. Earth is still, technically, a member. The enforcement action has not yet begun." I looked at the Arbiter. "Unless the Veth Dominion would like to add a violations of procedure charge to the list as well." Another murmur. This one had a slightly different quality. Somewhere to my left, I heard what I was fairly certain was the sound of the Kelith delegate suppressing something very close to a laugh of its own. Solnath deliberated for approximately 4 seconds. Then, with the gravity of someone agreeing to something they would regret, the Arbiter said, "The chamber will hear Representative Osai." I stood up, smoothed my jacket one more time, and walked to the podium. The chamber was very quiet. I looked out at 61 species, at compound eyes and echolocation slits and bioluminescent skin patches, and the quiet, patient gaze of beings who had been navigating the politics of the stars long before my ancestors had learned to write. I looked at Draveneth, who watched me with the detached certainty of a being who believed this was already over. I took a breath. "Before I explain," I said, "I want to ask the chamber one question, not a rhetorical one, a genuine one." The silence held. "Has anyone in this room," I said, "actually read Earth's history?" Nobody answered. I had not expected them to. "Then let me tell you a story," I said. "It starts about 200,000 years ago, and it ends this morning, and I promise it will explain why I was laughing." I could feel the weight of their attention settling onto me like a physical thing. 61 species, 300 star systems, and one human standing at a podium about to change the way all of them thought about the small blue planet that had been so easy to ignore. I took another breath. "It starts," I said, "with us nearly dying, several times, and what we did about it." It took me 45 seconds to establish the ground rules, because in any room where you are the underdog, the first thing you have to do is make sure everyone understands what kind of conversation is actually happening. "I want to be clear," I said, standing at the podium with my hands flat on the surface and my voice steady. "I am not here to protest the vote. The vote is the vote. I am here to provide context. And context, as any species with 600 years of diplomatic experience should appreciate, is everything." Draveneth said nothing. His crest had returned to its neutral gray. That was not a good sign. It meant he had decided to be patient, and Veth patience was the kind that came before a decision had already been made. I ignored him and spoke to the rest of the chamber. "The Veth Intelligence Division," I said, "intercepted data transmissions from 3 Earth research facilities. Those transmissions contained signatures consistent with adaptive reconfiguration systems. That is accurate. I will not dispute the data." A small ripple of attention moved through the room. They had expected me to dispute the data. "What I will dispute," I said, "is the interpretation." I had prepared for this. Not for this specific moment, because nobody had told me the Veth were going to call an emergency session that morning, but I had been preparing for something like it for years. When you are the representative of a species that nobody takes seriously, you learn to keep your arguments close, ready to be drawn quickly. the way someone who has walked through uncertain neighborhoods learns to keep their keys between their fingers. The adaptive reconfiguration signatures the VETH identified came from Earth's Cellular Repair Research Initiative, I said. Specifically, from 3 of its 17 active laboratories. The initiative was founded 9 years ago. Its mandate is the development of adaptive nanocellular repair systems. Its target application is oncological treatment. In plain language, we are building systems that can adapt to and repair damaged cells. We are building them to fight cancer. The chamber was very quiet. I would be happy, I said, to provide the full research documentation, peer review records, and patient outcome data to any member who would like to review it. The research has been published in Earth's open scientific journals for 7 years. The data signatures that the VETH flagged are the same signatures produced by the repair systems when they operate in a living organism. They are the same because they are the same technology. I let that sit for a moment. Then I said, the VETH Dominion's surveillance AI misclassified medical research as weapons development. The Council voted for war based on a classification error. The murmuring that broke out was not a polite murmur. It was the sound of 61 species recalibrating simultaneously, the way a room full of people sounds when someone has just said something that requires everyone to quietly revise what they thought they knew. Draveneth spoke before the arbiter could call order. His voice was very controlled. The signatures are within prohibited range. The application does not change the technical classification. Under Section 9, I said, the prohibition applies to adaptive reconfiguration systems designed for offensive or defensive weapons deployment. Our systems are designed to operate inside a human body at a cellular level. The mass is measured in nanograms. The effective range is approximately 4 centimeters. I invite the Dominion to explain how a 4-centimeter cellular repair tool constitutes a weapons system. The Kelith delegate, a quiet being from a species that communicated primarily through color shifts, had turned a shade of what I had learned to recognize as amused satisfaction. 3 other delegates were consulting their advisors in urgent whispers. The accords do not specify application, Draveneth said. They specify signature. The accords, I replied, pulling up the relevant text on the podium display, specify, and I am reading directly, systems designed and intended for adaptive reconfiguration of matter at scale for purposes of offensive or defensive military application. Intended. The word intended is in the statute. Our documentation, our research history, our published literature, and our patient records all establish intent clearly. If the Dominion's argument is that the word intended has no meaning, I would welcome that legal position in writing. A longer silence. I could feel the room shifting, not dramatically, not all at once, but the way a tide shifts, the way something that was moving one direction begins, slowly and without announcement, to move another way. Arbiter Solnath said, carefully, Representative Osai, you are stating that the foundational evidence for this morning's motion was a misclassification. I am stating exactly that, I said. And you have documentation to support this position. I have 9 years of documentation, I said. I can have the full archive transmitted to every member delegation within the hour. Solnath looked at Draveneth. Draveneth looked at me. His crest shifted, just slightly, into a color I had not seen before on a VETH. It was close to the pale gold they used for uncertainty, but with something darker in it. Something that might have been the beginning of understanding that the morning had not gone the way it was supposed to go. I also want to note, I said, and here I allowed my voice to stay exactly as calm as it had been since I started, because the next part required precision, that the medical research question is only one part of what I came to say today. The room went very still again. The VETH Dominion is correct that Earth has been developing technology that did not appear in any Council review submission, I said. They are correct about that. What they are incorrect about is which technology they found. I looked at Draveneth directly. We have been careful, I said, about what we submit to the Council, careful about what we build quietly and what we build in public. Every new member of a large institution, when they are paying attention, learns quickly which information is safe to share and which information should be held close. Earth has been paying attention. What are you implying? Draveneth said. His voice had dropped half a register. I am not implying anything, I said. I am telling you directly that humanity has been developing actual defense systems. Has been for several years. We simply did not file them because we never assumed the Council would be the deciding factor in whether those systems were needed. The silence that followed was different from all the previous silences. It was not the silence of confusion or recalibration. It was the silence of a room full of beings who had just heard something that changed the shape of the conversation entirely, and who were each, privately, deciding how to feel about it. Draveneth said, "That is a violation." "Is it?" I said. "Let me read you Article 31 of the Varath Accords. Member states retain the sovereign right to develop and maintain systems for the defense of their territories, provided such systems are not deployed aggressively against other member states. We have not deployed anything. We have not threatened anyone. We built things, in our own facilities, on our own worlds." I closed the display. "You declared war on Earth this morning," I said. "I want to make sure the Chamber understands the full picture before any enforcement action is considered, because here is what I have not told you yet." I looked across the room. 61 species, 300 systems, the Veth with their gray robes and their ancient patience and their fleet of warships that could cross a star system in 3 days. "Earth declared war on the Veth Dominion 11 years ago," I said. "We just did not tell anyone." Nobody moved. "We did not tell anyone," I continued, "because we did not want a war. We wanted to understand one. We wanted to understand what a war with the Veth would look like, what it would require, what it would cost, and what we would need to survive it. We spent 11 years answering those questions. Quietly, carefully, with the particular kind of focus that comes from a species that has never, in its entire history, had the luxury of assuming the universe would be kind to it." I let that land. Then I said, "And now I would like to tell you what we found." I did not grow up thinking about interstellar politics. When I was 8 years old, living in a flat in South London with my mother and my grandmother, and a window that overlooked a bus stop and nothing much else, the thing I thought about most was whether it would rain before I got home from school. My grandmother used to say that the thing about rain was that it did not care about your plans. It came when it came. You could check the forecast, carry an umbrella, wear a waterproof coat, and the rain would still arrive on its own schedule and drench you from a direction you had not expected. The only reasonable response, she told me, was to learn to walk fast and to never stand under trees. I thought about her a lot during those 11 years on Council Station Vale 7. The Chamber had given me a 15-minute recess after my last statement. I suspected that was less for my benefit and more to allow the various delegations to have urgent, whispered conversations with their advisors, without it being formally on the record. I used the time to get a fresh coffee from the small service corridor behind Gallery 7, and to stand very still for a moment and remind myself that I was, in fact, doing what I had prepared to do, and that the shaking I felt in my hands was adrenaline and not fear, or rather, it was both, and both were fine. When the Chamber reconvened, I went back to the podium. "I want to talk about what Earth has been doing for the past 11 years, I said. "Not what the Veth think we have been doing, and not what we told anyone we were doing. What we were actually doing." I started at the beginning. When Earth joined the Galactic Council, we were given access to the public record. That was standard. Every new member received the archive, which contained thousands of years of Council proceedings, trade agreements, territorial disputes, alliance structures, and military engagements. Most new members used the archive as a reference for navigating current politics. Earth's analysts used it as a threat assessment database. We read every military engagement the Council had recorded. All of them. We mapped the Veth Dominion's tactics across 300 years of conflict. We identified patterns. We noted what kinds of opponents they had faced, how they had adapted, what their response time looked like under pressure, where their supply chains stretched thin, and what happened to species that had made the mistake of underestimating them. We also noted what had happened to species that had made the mistake of trying to fight them head-on. That list was shorter and considerably more sobering. Earth's strategic position, I told the chamber, 11 years ago was this. We had 4 colonized worlds, 1 asteroid mining operation, and a fleet of ships that were designed primarily for exploration and resource transport. The Veth Dominion had 22 systems, 6 dedicated shipyard installations, and a military that had not lost a direct engagement in over a century. On paper, any direct conflict was not a conflict at all. It was an outcome, a foregone one. I paused. So we did not plan for a direct conflict. What we planned for instead was something that Earth's military theorists had spent centuries developing at home, long before anyone thought about stars. We planned for a situation where the resources, the geography, and the numbers were against us, and we had to win anyway. Where winning did not mean defeating the other side. It meant making the cost of defeating us higher than any sane opponent would be willing to pay. That planning started with information. Earth built its own intelligence network inside the Council's public systems. Not by hacking, not by breaking any laws, by reading, by attending every open session, every public committee, every trade forum and environmental review and border arbitration hearing, and by taking extraordinary notes. By the end of year 3, Earth's intelligence division had a more detailed map of the Veth Dominion's economic dependencies than the Veth's own Treasury Ministry. I did not say this to be impressive. I said it because it explained everything that came after. The Veth Dominion, I said, controls 22 star systems. Of those 22, 14 are actively productive. The other 8 are either resource-depleted, strategically positioned buffer zones, or legacy territories maintained for political reasons. Of the 14 productive systems, 9 depend on external trade relationships for at least 30% of their essential imports. I brought up a display that showed the trade network, simplified but accurate. Of those 9 systems, I continued, 7 conduct their primary trade through transit corridors that pass through the territories of council members who are not aligned with the Veth Dominion. I highlighted them. And of those 7 corridors, I said, 3 pass through the territory of members who voted against this morning's war declaration. The room was very quiet. The Veth Dominion's primary fuel depot for its Western Fleet, I said, is co-managed under a joint charter with the Oran Collective. The Oran Collective voted against the declaration this morning. The Veth's largest active shipyard leases its asteroid mining rights from the Pelian Federation under a treaty that contains a mutual respect clause, which is legally triggered by unilateral military aggression. The Pelian Federation voted against the declaration. The Veth's main data relay network for its Eastern communications runs through Kelith-held space. I looked at the Kelith delegate. They had turned a very specific shade of dark teal, which I had learned meant careful and concentrated attention. The Kelith voted against the declaration, I said. The silence in the chamber had a texture to it now. It was the texture of a room full of very experienced political minds doing mathematics they did not enjoy. I want to be clear, I said, that none of this was coordinated. I did not contact any of the 11 members who voted against the declaration before this morning. I have not made any agreements, promises, or arrangements with any of them. They voted the way they voted because of their own judgments about their own interests. I let that be heard. But I will tell you, I said, that Earth has spent 11 years building relationships with those members, not transactional ones, not alliances of convenience. We provided low-cost medical technology to 4 of them when their populations needed it. We hosted student exchange programs with 3 others. We co-authored research with 2 more. We showed up to their committee hearings and read their position papers and asked genuine questions and remembered the answers. I folded my hands on the podium. We were not buying loyalty, I said. We were building something that in human culture we call goodwill. The concept is simple. You treat other people decently over a long period of time without demanding anything immediately in return, and eventually the world shapes itself in ways that reflect that. It does not always work, but often enough it does. Draveneth had not spoken in several minutes. His crest was a color I had genuinely never seen on a Veth before. It was very pale, almost white, with a thin edge of yellow at the base. "This is all very interesting," he said finally, and his voice was carefully neutral in the way that means something is not, in fact, interesting, but rather alarming. But strategic relationships do not change the military calculus. The Veth Dominion's fleet remains what it is. "You are absolutely right," I said. "The fleet is impressive. No one is disputing that." I nodded. "And I want to be equally clear that Earth is not in any way claiming to be a military match for the Veth Dominion. We are not. We know exactly what we are and what we are not." I reached into the folder I had brought to the podium. "What I would like to share," I said, "is a signal intercepted by Earth's monitoring systems 47 minutes ago. This is from a secure Veth military channel. I have the decryption log and the transmission record." Draveneth went very still. "Earth's intelligence division has been monitoring Veth military communications for 6 years, I said. "Not aggressively, passively. We listened to the channels that use encryption standards we were able to model from publicly available Veth technical documentation, which, as it turns out, is quite a few of them." I read the intercept aloud. It was a message from a senior Veth fleet admiral to his logistics coordinator. It detailed the movement of 3 warships toward the outer edge of Earth's asteroid mining belt, ordered 42 minutes before I had come to the podium. A probing movement. A test. "I mention this," I said, "not as a threat and not as a protest. I mention it because I think the Chamber should understand the complete picture of this morning's events before any further decisions are made." I looked at Solnath. The Veth Dominion voted for war. Then, while I was being given my 15-minute recess, ordered a fleet movement toward Earth's territory. Solnath looked at Draveneth. Draveneth said nothing. "I would like to request," I said, "that the High Arbiter issue a procedural hold on all enforcement and military movements while the Chamber reviews the evidentiary questions I have raised today. If the Veth's intelligence data was incorrect, and I have provided substantial reason to believe it was, then this morning's declaration may have been founded on a false premise. Proceeding militarily before that question is resolved would not be justice. It would be momentum." I stepped back from the podium. "I am not asking for mercy," I said. "I am not asking for sympathy. I am asking for accuracy. Earth will accept whatever judgment this Chamber reaches once it has all the facts. We have always been willing to do that." I looked at the room one last time. "We have just never been willing to accept a judgment reached without them." I went back to my seat. The Chamber was quiet for a long moment. Then the Arbiter called a full recess. I picked up my coffee. It had gone cold, but I drank it anyway. My grandmother had also told me that you drink what you have, not what you wish you had, and that the difference between those two things was the difference between people who got through hard days and people who did not. I thought she would have found the morning fairly satisfying. The 3 Veth ships entered the outer zone of Earth's asteroid mining belt at 3:40 station time. I know the exact time because I was still awake, sitting in my quarters with my tablet open, and the live feed from Earth's monitoring network running in the lower corner of the screen. I had not slept. The Chamber's full recess had extended through the afternoon and into the evening while delegations consulted, advisors argued, and the Veth Dominion issued a formal statement saying that it stood by the accuracy of its intelligence assessment and reserved the right to proceed with enforcement. The 3 ships were designated Veth Patrol Configuration 7, which in Veth military doctrine meant a show of presence formation. Not an attack, a demonstration. They would enter a contested zone, hold position, and wait. The expected response from the other party was either a protest communication or a withdrawal of presence from the area. The Veth had used this maneuver 43 times in the last 100 years, according to the Council's public conflict record. 43 times it had worked. My tablet showed the asteroid belt feed. The belt was enormous, a wide ring of slow-drifting rock and processed ore carriers, and the occasional manned survey platform. Earth had been operating there for 6 years. At any given time, there were roughly 40 to 50 automated ore hauler vessels in the belt, running their quiet routes between the processing stations and the transport waypoints. I watched the 3 Veth ships move into position. Then I watched something else. The ore haulers were moving. Not all of them, not dramatically, but 37 of the 49 haulers currently logged in the active zone had, over the preceding 4 hours, shifted their routes in small increments, the kind of small increments that automated logistics systems made all the time, adjustments for orbital mechanics, for collision avoidance, for fuel efficiency. Nothing that would have flagged as unusual in any traffic monitoring system. Except the adjustments had placed them in a configuration that I recognized because I had read the briefing document when Earth's engineering teams had first proposed it, 3 years earlier. They called it the buffer array. It was not a weapon. That is the first thing I want to be precise about because precision matters. The ore haulers were cargo vessels. They carried processed nickel iron, silicate ore, and refined metals from the belt's processing stations to the outer transport waypoints. Each one massed approximately 12,000 tons when fully loaded. They moved slowly, their accelerators designed for efficiency and fuel conservation, not speed. But they were very, very large. And when 37 of them, each carrying a full load of dense asteroid material, arranged themselves into an overlapping pattern around a defined zone of space, what they created was a barrier. Not a wall, not a shield, a consequence. Anything moving through that zone at speed would encounter a field of slow-drifting 12,000-ton objects with the combined navigational flexibility of a geological formation. The Veth ship's navigational AI registered them as civilian vessels. Registered them that way for 11 minutes. Then one of the haulers, responding to its automated proximity alert, adjusted course by 4 degrees, and the Veth lead ship's collision prediction system suddenly calculated what the array meant in practical terms and flagged it. I was watching the feed when the Veth lead ship reduced speed. I watched it hold position outside the array's outer edge. I watched it sit there for 3 minutes, which in terms of military decision-making under pressure is a very long time indeed. Then the communication came through, not to me, to the Council Station's public receiving channel, which meant it went on the official record. It was from the Veth lead ship's commander, a name that translated roughly as Fleet Voice Orineth, and it requested clarification on the operational status of the civilian vessels in the zone. Earth's mining operations automated response system replied within 8 seconds. It confirmed that all vessels were active automated cargo carriers operating within their registered lanes. It offered, politely and without any emphasis, a complete route map for safe transit through the array if the incoming vessels required navigational assistance. Fleet Voice Orineth did not respond for 6 minutes. In those 6 minutes, I got up and made myself a cup of tea, because my hands needed something to do and I had run out of coffee. I stood in my small kitchen and waited and thought about my grandmother, and about rain, and about how the thing about a good plan was that it did not need you to do very much once it was in motion. When Orineth's response came, it said, simply, that the patrol formation was conducting routine navigation assessment and would continue monitoring the zone. They did not enter the array. 40 minutes later, they began withdrawing. I did not watch the whole withdrawal. I turned off the feed, finished my tea, and tried to sleep, with mixed results. What I was thinking about, as I lay in the dark with the station systems humming around me and 300 star systems somewhere outside the hull going about their long, complicated business, was not the success of the moment. It was something simpler than that. I was thinking about the ore haulers, about the fact that Earth had looked at its situation years before this morning and had said, "We cannot match a Veth fleet in a direct engagement. So what do we have? We have asteroid mining operations. We have ore haulers. We have material and we have geometry, and we have the engineering capacity to think carefully about both." The array had been the idea of a woman named Claire Odom, who was an orbital mechanics specialist from a small research team in New Zealand. She had proposed it in a briefing document that began, quietly and without drama, with the sentence, "If we cannot be stronger, we should think about being inconvenient." That document had been approved, refined, and implemented over 3 years. Nobody had announced it. Nobody had filed it with the council. 49 ore haulers had been given updated navigational software that included, alongside their standard logistics programming, a secondary routine that could be triggered remotely or activated automatically under specific proximity conditions. The Veth ships had excellent weapons. They had excellent shielding. They had excellent tactical AI. None of those things were useful against 37 12,000-ton cargo vessels, drifting through legally registered commercial lanes. The next morning, word reached me through two separate sources, one of them official and one of them the kind of informal intelligence that circulates through diplomatic corridors when something significant has happened, and everyone is watching everyone else to see how they react. The word was that Fleet Voice Orinath had filed an internal report with the Veth Military Command. The report described the encounter in precise technical language, as military reports do. But buried in the operational assessment section, in the clipped, professional phrasing of a commander who was being careful, was a sentence that one of Earth's contacts had been able to retrieve. The sentence said, "Recommend full strategic review of Earth engagement parameters. Opponent demonstrates non-standard operational thinking." Non-standard operational thinking. I read that 3 times. Then I went to the chamber for the resumed session. The session was different in character from the day before. The previous day had been sharp, confrontational, driven by the Veth certainty and the council's deference to it. Today, the edges had softened slightly, not because anyone had changed sides, but because information had moved through the station overnight, the way information always moves, informally and quickly, and through channels that are technically unofficial but thoroughly effective. And by the time the arbiter called the session to order, most of the delegates in that room knew, at least in broad outline, what had happened in the asteroid belt. The Veth had moved 3 ships. The ships had stopped. The ships had turned around. Nothing had been fired. Nothing had been damaged. No one had been hurt. In purely mechanical terms, it was a non-event, a patrol that encountered an obstacle and withdrew. But everyone in that room had enough political experience to understand that what had actually happened was not nothing. What had happened was a test. The Veth had tested Earth's response to a show of presence formation. And Earth's response had been to arrange a field of slow-moving rocks in a pattern that made the show of presence formation irrelevant, and then to offer navigational assistance. That was the part that had made the overnight conversation so interesting. The offer of navigational assistance. Earth's automated system had not issued a warning. It had not made a threat. It had not broadcast any kind of defiant message. It had offered help. In the politest possible operational language, it had said, "Here is a route map if you need it." The Keleth delegate had turned a shade of bright orange at some point during the previous evening, which I had learned from my reading was the closest their species came to genuine delight. Arbiter Solnath opened the session by announcing that the Council's Review Committee had examined Earth's submitted documentation on the Cellular Repair Research Initiative and found it consistent with Earth's stated application of medical research. The committee had further determined that the technical signatures identified by Veth intelligence fell within a classification gray area that required additional interpretive review before any determination of violation could be formally confirmed. Dravineth requested the floor. Solnath granted it. Dravineth stood at the podium for a moment without speaking, which for a Veth was unusual. They were precise beings. They did not pause for effect. When they paused, it meant something was being calculated. "The Veth Dominion," he said, "acknowledges that the evidentiary basis for the emergency motion may require further review." The chamber held very still. The Dominion would be prepared to support a procedural hold on enforcement actions pending that review, he said, provided that Earth's representative commits to full transparency regarding the systems in question and submits all relevant research documentation to the Council's technical committee. He looked at me. I stood. Earth is prepared to submit all documentation related to the Cellular Repair Research Initiative, I said. We will also submit a full technical briefing on the navigational software currently installed in our mining fleet's automated vessels, in the interest of transparency. I paused exactly 1 second. We have nothing to hide. Draveneth's crest shifted. He sat down. The procedural hold passed 54-3. The rescission vote happened 6 days later. It was not dramatic. Most things in the Galactic Council were not dramatic when you looked at them directly. They were long and procedural and conducted in the kind of formal language that kept emotion at a careful distance from decision-making. The Veth Dominion moved to withdraw the emergency declaration. The motion was seconded by 4 members, including 2 who had voted in favor of the original declaration. The vote came in at 51 in favor, 3 opposed, 7 abstaining. I voted in favor of the withdrawal. Of course I did. I was a professional. I did not laugh this time. I had done my laughing. This was not a moment for laughing. This was a moment for voting, recording my vote, nodding it in the session transcript, and then sitting quietly while the arbiter moved on to the next item of business, which was a trade route renegotiation between 2 members who had been disputing the same asteroid cluster for 40 years and showed no sign of resolving it. I sat through 2 hours of asteroid cluster arbitration with the same expression I used for everything in that chamber, which was attentive and calm and gave nothing away. Then the session ended, and I went back to my quarters, and I made a cup of coffee from the last of the good beans I had been saving, and I sat by the observation port and looked at the stars for a long time. I want to tell you something honest about that moment, because this story is told in my voice, and I have tried to tell it accurately, which means I should tell you what I actually felt, not the version that sounds better. I felt tired, not defeated, not unhappy, tired in the way you feel after something you have been carrying for a long time has finally been set down, and your muscles have not yet understood that they can stop bracing. I had been carrying the weight of that situation, in one form or another, since the day I had taken the posting. 11 years of sitting in rooms where nobody expected me to matter, taking notes, building files, learning names and systems, and the particular texture of each species' way of thinking. 11 years of being patient. The patience had worked, but patience is work and work leaves a mark. I thought about Claire Odom in her office in New Zealand, writing a document about orbital mechanics and inconvenience, about the analysts who had read 600 years of council records and built their threat models quietly, without credit, without anyone outside a very small group knowing what they were doing. About the people in the medical research labs who were genuinely, straightforwardly, trying to cure cancer, and who had accidentally become the center of an interstellar incident because a surveillance AI had not read the application field carefully enough. About the miners who had operated that ore hauler fleet every day for years, following their standard routes, and who had one day received a software update and been told, in the briefest possible terms, that their ships had a secondary capability, and that it might be activated someday, and to please not worry about it. None of those people were diplomats. None of them had spent years in council chambers. They were scientists and engineers and miners and analysts, and, in the case of my grandmother, a woman who had opinions about rain and practical advice about trees. Earth's strength, when I thought about it carefully, had never been the things we built. It had been the way we thought about what we needed and then went and built it, quietly, without announcing it, without asking permission, without waiting for someone to tell us it was possible. The Veth had 600 years of history, 12 centuries of military doctrine, fleets that crossed star systems in days. They had been powerful for so long that power had come to feel like weather to them, something that simply was, that did not need to be earned or maintained or thought about carefully, because it had always been there, and they assumed it always would be. Earth had never had that luxury, not once, not for a single century of our entire history. We had survived ice ages by learning to make fire. We had survived plagues by learning to understand disease. We had survived conflicts by learning, slowly and with enormous cost, to stop having so many of them. Every catastrophe in our history had produced somewhere a person who had looked at the situation and decided it was not over yet and gone to work. We had brought that with us when we came to the stars. We could not have left it behind if we tried. It was not strategy, it was character. A few days after the rescission, Draveneth came to find me. He arrived at my quarters without announcement, which was unusual for a Veth. They valued formal protocol. An unannounced visit was the closest his species came to indicating that something mattered enough to bypass the usual procedures. I offered him a seat, and he took it, folding his long frame into the chair with the careful precision of someone accommodating furniture that was not designed for his anatomy. He looked at me for a moment with his pale eyes, and then he said, "I would like to understand something." "Ask," I said. "Your species has been a council member for 11 years, he said. "In the history of this institution, no member state has outmaneuvered the Veth Dominion in the first 50 years of membership. Several have tried. None have managed it. Most did not realize they were attempting it until it was too late." "We were not trying to outmaneuver anyone," I said. He paused. "No. No," I said. "We were trying to survive. There is a difference." He considered this. "You assumed," I said, "that we did not represent a significant variable in your calculations. That is a reasonable assumption given the numbers. 4 worlds, 1 mining operation, 11 years. On paper, we are not impressive." I looked at him steadily. "But the Veth have not spent much time studying us, have they? Not really. Not the way we studied you." His crest moved slightly. "We reviewed your public record." "You reviewed our published history," I said. "Our cultural output, our political structures. You noted that we were fractious and noisy and had spent a great deal of our history in conflict with each other, and you concluded that this made us disorganized." I paused. "You did not consider what it means to have spent your entire history in conflict and to still be here." He was quiet. "Every civilization that has ever threatened us," I said. "We are still here. The ice came and we learned to make fire. The diseases came and we learned to make medicine. The conflicts came and we learned, slowly and badly and with a great deal of cost, to make peace. Not always, not perfectly, but enough." I looked at the stars through the observation port. "We are still here, and we carry all of that with us, every piece of it, the disasters and the responses and the things we built because we had no other choice." Draveneth said, very quietly, "That is a difficult way to exist." "Yes," I agreed. "It is. But it produces a certain kind of thinking that is hard to develop any other way." He stood to leave. At the door he stopped. "Representative Osai," he said, "I would like to propose through the appropriate channels a formal dialogue between Earth and the Veth Dominion, not a trade negotiation, a conversation about history, about strategy, about what the Council should understand that it does not currently understand." I looked at him. "I will clear my schedule," I said. He left. I stayed by the window for a while longer. The stars were very still, the way they always are when you are looking at them through glass, the motion of everything out there invisible from this distance, the distances too large for any individual moment to show its change. I thought about what I would write in my report to Earth's government. I thought about the ore haulers still running their routes in the belt, patient and slow, and carrying their weight. I thought about Claire Odom's document and its quiet opening sentence. "If we cannot be stronger, we should think about being inconvenient." Then I thought of something wider than that. We had not won because we were stronger. We had not won because we were smarter, or better organized, or more advanced. We had won, if winning was even the right word for what had happened in the last 6 days, because we had spent 11 years taking the situation seriously while everyone else had assumed it did not need to be taken seriously at all. That was the part I wanted Earth to understand. Not the tactics, not the ore haulers, the habit. The particular, deep-rooted, hard-earned human habit of treating every situation as something that required your complete attention, your best thinking, and your most honest assessment of what you actually had to work with. We had gone to the stars and we had sat in rooms where nobody expected us to matter, and we had paid attention, and we had waited, and when the moment came, we had been ready. Not because we were exceptional, because we had never once believed that the universe owed us anything, and so we had gone ahead and earned it anyway. Outside the observation port, the stars held their distances, 300 systems, thousands of years of history, a council that had fallen silent briefly and then resumed its long, complicated business. And somewhere out there, 4 small worlds and 1 asteroid mining belt, occupied by a species that had no intention of being caught off guard again. The Galactic Council had declared war on Earth and discovered, to their significant surprise, that Earth had already been paying attention for years. We were going to get along fine out here. We had been through worse. We had been through much, much worse. And the thing about species that come through the worst of what the universe can offer and keep going is that they carry with them something no fleet and no treaty and no political declaration can replicate. They carry the certainty that they will still be here. We carry that with us everywhere we go. And we always will.